Today, we're diving deep into the dynamics of human relationships. We're going to be talking about conflict, extreme conflict, light conflict, everyday conflict. We're going to be talking about teamwork, about chaos, about systems theory, and about how to make the world a better place by being ourselves and by developing skills and capacities to make us more influential, more peaceful, and more engaged in our world. I hope you really enjoy it. Without further ado, Zach Stone, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we met just over LinkedIn messages a couple of 3 weeks ago, a month ago, and we kind of realized that we think a lot of the same types of things.
Yeah, I was listening to your podcast with Dr. Boyatsis, I believe, and it really struck me, the conversation you were having about change. And I thought, yeah, these guys get it. And this is a really cool conversation that I'm getting a lot of value out of. And so I just wanted to reach out and let you know that I appreciated what you were getting into, because I think it's a part of the change conversation that is often neglected, sometimes in the org dev business change world. And so, yeah, really, it was really cool stuff.
Yeah, and as we communicated, you kept on saying more and more interesting things until I finally couldn't keep them to myself. So here we are. I guess let's start by just you introducing yourself and kind of giving us context for what you do and where and why, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, well, thanks. So I originally got started in 1999. I was a younger gentleman, and I was a teenager. I was getting into trouble, and my mom said, you got to do something of value with your time. You're kind of a knucklehead. I think that you would like this training program that's happening in DC. The American Friends Service Committee is teaching youth and teenagers how to facilitate groups and teaching them about conflict transformation. It's this thing called the Help Increase the Peace program. And I actually have the manual over here. It's this big purple manual that I've had since the 90s.
Oh my gosh.
The Empowering Youth Through Conflict Resolution and Community Building. And they taught us the theory of group dynamics, and I was in just getting into high school at this time, and so I went and I got trained, and there were people in there that were formerly incarcerated, and you had former gang members who were then taking this type of information and working with even younger gang members to try to do recidivism work and get people not to go back to prison. And I started working as a junior facilitator, working with some of these folks with kids who were in and out of jail and adults who were we started doing victim offender conferencing, where the victim sits down with the offender. And I trained under my mom, who was a gang violence interventionist and a group facilitator for a number of years before starting to work with some really awesomely talented people out of the School for International Training up in Vermont, who were also cadre of peers at that time. And I fell in love with group dynamics. And it sounds silly because you're a high schooler, but it was one of those things where being in circle with people made me feel fulfilled. It made me, my mom tells a story where I turned to her and I was 15 and I said, wow, I feel full after a group facilitation. And it's something that stuck with me. And so I got into behavioral science. I was really fascinated by how people change, how they interact in groups. Went to Drexel for behavioral science and counseling. And then I got into business development and started doing change management work as a consultant for a number of years, and eventually started my own company, and then moved on from that. And it's been kind of a wild journey moving into software development and other ways that behavioral change can help businesses improve and evolve. And so that's my long story in a nutshell.
Wow. So did you grow up Quaker or in the Quaker community?
Well, I grew up Unitarian Universalist, so we were Quaker-adjacent. And so, I think my mom knew of those folks and was like, yeah, you do well with them. Go hang out with them for a little bit. It'll straighten you out.
Gotcha. 'Cause I don't know if you know this, but I taught at a friend's school for 10 years.
No, I didn't know that. That's very cool.
So I'm very familiar with AFSC.
Yeah, they're a good group of folks. And I think the mentality of their group really shaped how I interact doing group facilitation. That sort of, that egalitarian mentality is a really good way to approach group work.
And it's amazing you still have the manual and you still afford it this much, respect.
I use icebreakers from that in corporations that I work with. And I have somewhat reluctantly been given the label of like icebreaker king, which is kind of hilarious because I'm using these icebreakers from AFSC, and I'll show people the manual, but like I'm using these 90s icebreakers that were used with, you know, gang members to work in a corporate setting, and it works. I mean, it's people are people wherever you go.
Yeah, I'm remembering one of the resources that I had. Well, first there were the two books of what were they called? Those games, new games, the new games manual, and then I got this card deck. I think we paid a huge amount of money for like 300 or 400 index cards of activities. It was called Abris, like something like games of, you know, yeah. I think
they put out a lot of cool resources, you know, and it's stuff that you can kind of use anywhere.
Yeah. So I'm real curious about you at 15 being, you know, as you described, a kind of troublemaker, knucklehead, and then discovering something in a group that filled you in a way that I'm guessing hadn't before. Like, what was it, do you think?
You know, that is a great question. I think there was this sense of connectedness that I felt working with people. There was a sense of competency that I felt of sort of like, you know, I was charismatic at that age, and I really was able to connect with people pretty easily. And, you know, you're using that stuff at high school to get free drinks at the mall. You're not using that stuff like to do good in your community. And so getting the chance to learn these skills and then using my ability to connect with others to help people kind of self-reflect, to think about, like, is violence the most effective path for me? You know, who do I want to be? Who do I want to grow into? Being able to facilitate those conversations with people felt like I was doing something really good with my interpersonal skills. And that felt really great.
Wow. It sounds like you lucked into like you're a use for a superpower that like the way you describe being charismatic in the wrong setting is a horrible thing, right?
Can be. Yeah. I mean, I think my mom has a lot of foresight and was like, you know, this will be good for you. You'll like it. And she was right. And then it ended up really becoming my career. And so, you know, it was one of those things where I think at that age I was like, I want to own a nightclub when I get older. You know, I want to, you know, have like a community where people can come together and connect. And I have that now, but in a very different way from what I thought it was going to be when I was younger.
So, what did you learn from that time that you are still using that still feels fundamental?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. A lot of things, I think, is the easy answer. But to get more specific, how people act when they feel disempowered, how you can work with people when you're in the midst of conflict, is a really powerful skill set that I use not only in the corporate world, but I use it in my personal relationship with my wife. And we just had our 9-year anniversary yesterday. And
congratulations!
Thank you. It is such a practical skill set to be able to, when someone is angry at you and sort of yelling at you or frustrated, for you to sit back and be able to remove yourself a little bit and try to get under the surface. There was a part of the Help Increase the Peace program that looks at positions versus needs, and how the things people say are their positions, but that's different from what's under the surface for them, what's happening, where their needs and their fears and their biases and their traumas live. And being able to step back in the moment and get under the surface has really served me working with teams, working in with businesses and union negotiations that I got into later, working alongside labor unions and Transport Workers Union in Philadelphia. And so, it's a tremendously powerful skill set. And those types of skills that American Friends were teaching about really parlayed into the behavioral science work that I got into later in life, understanding things like motivational interviewing, understanding resistance to change, understanding how to sort of help shape a group dynamic to be a bit healthier, but a little bit less toxic, create more psychological safety in the workplace.
So I'm really interested in that capacity to have somebody yelling at you and like shooting anger at you and remaining centered and calm and functional. Because I feel like I know everything you know about that, but I don't. Yeah. But that doesn't mean I can do it, or that I do it you know, consistently, or that like the kettle doesn't boil over in me. So I'm wondering about like how much of that is innate, how much of that is skill, and how much of that is some sort of capacity building that you had to do, or maybe you didn't have to do in order to, right?
Yeah.
Like all of us can get triggered. Like
Yeah.
what's the formula or the recipe or the needs to do that better than I do? Let's say.
Oh, look, I mean, I do get triggered and I do have conflicts. It's not to say that I don't. I'm sure my wife would be happy to peek her head in here and say, hey, yes, we have conflicts. For me, it is the combination that you mentioned. Yes, there is some innate, I suppose, there is some innate empathy, but you have it too. But for me, I think some of the things that helped, obviously, I went to school for behavioral science, and Drexel's really cool because they put you through these sort of internship programs. You also have to do a number of, you do simulation labs where they basically bring in actors and they try to trigger you, they try to stump you, they try to frustrate you and anger you, and you sit with those people and you practice. And then certainly I think I really was shaped through the fire working with unions in Philadelphia, where I was there to help folks and facilitate conversation. And we were working with SEPTA, the bus and train company there that runs the public transit system in Philly. And then I started doing that across the country. And so you're almost like a third party intervener coming in, hired by management to work with them in the union. But you're not unbiased because you're being paid by one group. But you are sort of the face that people are seeing for them to put their frustration on you. And so it forced me to get really good at sort of being a vessel, sort of opening up myself and saying, hey, this isn't about you. And if it is about you, you got to listen first. And I would get heated. I mean, I'd be sitting there in a chair and someone would be threatening me with physical violence. And I'd be like, don't respond. This whole group is watching you to see what you're going to do. Do not, like, this is bait. And in fact, the person that was challenging me was generally hoping that I would respond in a way that would give them a lot of ammunition. But I knew that if I could hold it down and I could respond to them in a way with empathy and compassion and usually I was using motivational interviewing. I was using ORs, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summarizing to just kind of give it back to them. So, okay, so if you feel like if I was in your position, I was out there on that bus, you would have beaten my ass, to quote you. And they say, yeah, that's exactly right. And then they'd sort of like, I can't believe he just agreed with me, and they'd start to deflate a little bit. And I started to really see over time, like, wow, this is really damn effective. And around the same time, I was starting to I was getting married, and I was starting to use this stuff more and more in my relationship, and that took a long time because it's easier for me to do it when I'm getting paid. It's a little bit harder when you're not getting paid. And so, yeah, I think it's a mix of things. It is practice, it is learning, it's seeing that it's successful over and over and over again, and then it's growing up. I'm hitting middle age, and the brashness of my youth is hopefully being slowly eroded a little bit with like slightly more wisdom than I used to have.
Right. Yeah, that's one of my main reasons. That's one of my main reasons for trying to eat so healthy is so eventually I make it to maturity.
Yeah, that's a good practice. You got to eat your veggies.
Yeah. I'm really interested in the stuff that you described from Drexel around these, because it feels like it was a safe place to feel unsafe things. And I don't think I've had that. I think I've either been in a classroom learning about it or thrown into a situation where some part of my perception, like if a guy's threatening me, like some part of my brain has to decide, is this words or is this real? Right? Like I'm really curious about a process, and maybe, I wonder if what you learned there is something that we can do out in the world to help people feel safe, a safe container where they get to practice feeling unsafe.
You absolutely can do that. When I was hired by organizations, before I got into the more change management work, I was doing a lot of crisis intervention, anti-violence work, teaching professionals how to deal with high stress situations. And because I had done some crisis work, and the people that I was working with at that time were former crisis workers, international negotiators, had done work in Bosnia and Rwanda, and Israel and Palestine. And so, what we were doing is we were going into companies and we were kind of recreating, things from HIP and things from, the Drexel, the Sim Labs, and we were bringing that to companies. And so we would sit down with EMTs and bus drivers and train conductors and firefighters and home visitors and nurses and doctors, and we would create environments that were simulated, obviously, but they were meant to feel unsafe with fake guns and fake knives, or with role plays, very screaming at people. And I remember one in particular where I kind of learned an interesting lesson. I was doing a role play with my co-facilitator, and there was a woman in the training who said, can you role play what it would be like if someone is maybe about to commit suicide on the train platform? They were a train conductor, worked in the subway, and we said, yeah, sure, we can role play this out. And this was years back, and sort of before the sort of idea of trigger warnings came to the front. And we were sort of like, yes, we can do this. And it's a group of professionals there who have seen this before, and so we figured, yeah, this is safe. And so we did a role play that was extremely convincing. My co-facilitator really brought the energy. And as we arrived at the end of the role play, I remember this participant bawling, and they could squeak out, "My mother jumped in front of a train, and I wish someone had been there to talk her down." And nobody was, and that's why I became working the subway. And I was like, oh man, there goes the rest of the afternoon. What did we do to this poor person? How do we, you're in a corporate training. What do you do? Do you stop the whole thing? So what we ended up doing was we put a hold and said, all right, hold on everyone. Let's, we're going to process this. And I talked to the participants and said, hey, how about we step out a little bit? And I ended up spending much of the afternoon talking with them and working through some of what they saw. And it ended up being pretty cathartic, but that could easily have gone in a very different direction. And so, yes, you can run sessions where you simulate this stuff. It's obviously not real life, but you can artificially help people reach a level of simulated arousal or triggering, that they can start to work through some of these things a little bit. And you know this, but I'll say it for others who may not. The brain is both wonderfully complex and simple at the same time. We don't have a full capacity to differentiate between something that's fake that we're seeing on TV in a movie and something that we're seeing in front of us. Yes, you can say, I know this isn't real, but when you watch a horror movie and it's particularly intense, people's heart rate still goes up, they still sweat, people have nightmares, some people get really triggered, and so yeah, you can use role plays in simulated activities very effectively, but you have to be careful in how you do it. So yes, it's possible, but be ready for some interesting responses and roller coasters.
Yeah, and as I think back to the work I've done, a lot of it for the past several years obviously has been over Zoom. Before that, Skype or even just phone calls. Comparing that to in person, where there's just a lot more control. And if I'm facilitating a particularly intense group experience and somebody is unable to handle it, they can walk away and be outside, as opposed to if we're doing it, in a Zoom Hollywood Squares and they're gone and nobody knows where they went and everyone's worried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, how I'm curious from your side of this. Like, do you have a preference for in person versus virtual? Pros and cons.
I think they're both great. I mean, just for my lifestyle, I love being able to do this and, visit people all over the world in a single day. Most of the time, we'll start on Zoom or something, but after a few sessions, we're just doing walking coaching. So we get to be outside. And if we're both walking, it kind of feels a little bit like we're walking together.
Yeah.
But there's absolutely stuff that has to happen in person. I think we're, in the age of machine learning, it's tempting to forget that we are meat bags.
Yes, it is.
But we're pretty meaty.
I am lucky that we can do this virtual thing because I wouldn't get to live in this place that I love in New Mexico. But there are some moments that I wish that I could be in person with people. I was working with a team that was located in Kharkiv, Ukraine. We were building a
Okay,
mobile
so
application in 2022, and right as we were kind of hitting our groove as a team, the bombs started falling on their city. And, you know, we knew that something was coming because the Russian offensive was kind of pushing in, and they were both incredibly brave and also obviously very scared and concerned for what was coming. And you know, I remember I was doing a stand-up session, running a stand-up when we're talking about the state of the application and kind of where we're at. Some of the developers were in bomb shelters, and the lights are shaking and going off, and you can hear these noises. And I remember like my heart breaking when one of the developers said, "Hey, I'm really sorry. I have bad signal right now. I apologize." And I'm thinking like, you're being bombed and you're running for your life and you're apologizing to me for not like having the best stand up. And it was one of those moments where I felt incredibly inadequate as a team lead, as a support, as a behavioralist, feeling like here are these people going through actual war, and what can I give them through the screen? I want to be able to connect with them better, and we did find a way through that process, but it was incredibly trying for me to try to leverage my behavioral science skills in a way in the corporate space in a way I hadn't done in a long time. And so I think about this thing about how effective we are virtually versus being in person, and how the dynamic changes when they can feel you and see you and touch you and kind of have that experience of you right in front of them, of you being with them. And so, you know, obviously I wouldn't give up the virtual stuff, but there are moments when I wish I could reach through the screen.
yeah. So most of your work is virtual at this point?
Yeah, every once in a while, I will reconnect up with Red Kite Project, my old firm that I started in 2008, and like we'll do an in-person training, or we'll do facilitation, and fills you back up. But a lot of what I'm doing now is virtual, working with software development teams. I support a department of about 30 teams, doing nursing and health education work, developing those applications, and it's awesome. And I miss being with people.
So I have a question which comes from a professionally selfish perspective, which is like the work that you and I do around, it's the humanity building work. Yeah. And we got to sell it to people who are like talking about ROI and aren't necessarily on our wavelength. How do you what are the things that the needs that you hear that you then translate into this heart-centered, body-centered approach that I do can address it?
Yeah, what an awesome question. I'm going to go back to Red Kite Project because it's a little bit easier for me now.
Say the name of the thing.
Red
Kite. Okay,
and that was the group that was doing work with like high stress industries and kind of bringing behavioral science and trauma informed counseling and civil society building to corporations. And our biggest challenge, especially early on before we developed any sort of reputation, was how do you sell people on this stuff that a lot of those folks would call, they called it frou-frou, or they would call, that fluffy soft skills. And I recently did a panel with someone where they said, I don't call that stuff soft skills. I call it the essential skills of how to navigate your humanity. And I thought that was awesome. Because I haven't thought of it like that, and I hadn't pitched it like that. But we learned fairly quickly that you could sell people on these very essential support services, but you had to frame it in a way that would be palatable to them. And what that looked like was, we had partners that were doing research on our outcomes. And in our first early couple of years, we had a major reduction in absenteeism and a major reduction in turnover and violent incidents amongst the people that were going through our programs. And that sort of language around, hey, when people feel supported, when they feel safe, when they are not burned out, when they're able to tap into their healthier habits, you are seeing less absenteeism, you're seeing less turnover, you have less health insurance claims, you have people getting sick, less frequently. They're able to recognize it, and maybe they go out for a day, but they don't keep working and then get sick for 2 weeks and end up in the hospital. And so that type of preventative care, Yale did a study on it, and they found that for companies that invest, for every dollar they invest in wellness programs, there's a $3 return for their employees. That was, years ago. I want to say that was 2011. I need to go back and look at if that research has been replicated again. But over the years, I did see, as they looked into wellness programs that were science and evidence-based, that you get great returns from that stuff if you actually implement it. And so using that type of language, we were able to really get the interest of corporations to say, yeah, actually maybe this behavioral science stuff has some value with our people and with us as maybe managers. And then as the managers had some benefits, the leaders said, yeah, actually we should use this too. And then the reputation started to grow and the sell became a little bit easier, but that was the core idea.
Gotcha. Okay, so you've sold the decision maker. They've accepted your invoice, told you to get started. Now you got a room full of people. Is there resistance there when you start?
It depends. So many depends. If they have heard really good things from their peers, resistance goes down a bit, but you still will have some resistance. There are folks, I mean, you've done this for decades. And so, sometimes there's someone who wants to feel powerful because they feel disempowered in their work and in the workspace. And you are a person that they can act that out on because you are safer than their manager or their boss. You're an extension of them, but you aren't them and you don't have the power they have. And so they can make an example of you. It's a lot harder if you use oars and resistance tools to kind of like I am rubber, you are glue type of stuff. It's hard for them to get purchase. And then the people around them are sort of like, well, this is silly. Nothing they're saying is doing anything. And these people are really nice. Knock it off. And so there's ways to kind of combat that. But we would do this thing at the start of the workshops where we would sit down and basically try to name and own their resistance. We would say, hey, we get that this is going to seem outlandish. We get that you maybe don't want to be here, that you don't care about this stuff, that, like, who are we to be telling you how to do your job? And just by giving voice to it, people would sort of come to this realization of like, oh, okay, they at least get that I don't like them off the bat. And it was like a little bit easier to get started. And I started doing that with the software teams that I started working with later in my career, just being like, I get it. Who am I to tell you how to do your job? Well, guess what? I'm not here to tell you how to do your job. Let's talk about some of the things that you are frustrated about, and like, let's get that stuff out on the table. And by naming and owning it and not, and being authentic with people and not like sort of towing the corporate line, really went a long way to lower resistance and have people kind of welcome you in.
Yeah, I first encountered that strategy when I met Chris Voss's work.
Oh yeah,
right?
sure.
The Negotiator. He talked about like the accusation audit, where you think about every horrible thing they could be thinking, and you say it first.
Very cool. Yeah, you know what? I know of him and I've read some of his things, but I haven't heard of the accusation audit. That's very cool naming to have. So now I can name the naming. Nice.
Yeah, that's fun stuff. So in our LinkedIn messaging conversation, you were talking about chaos.
Yes.
And that's something that you think about a lot. So what does that mean? Where do you see chaos in the world? I'm confused.
Where don't I see chaos in the world? The work that I did with Red Kite was focused on techniques that they developed for war zones after war zones had sort of started to wind down a little bit, and how do people rebuild after there is like literally no structure left. And we use that stuff very effectively in organizations to revitalize sort of chaotic leadership and broken structures, really unfair, lack of trust environments. And it can work in a lot of places, but one of the things I learned from that work is that chaos is not something you can control. You surf it, and we have lived, many of us, not all of us, but those of us who've been privileged enough to live through the past couple decades with some level of prosperity. We've been living sort of through an unprecedented time in relation to the rest of history, where in other parts of history, disease and pandemic are fairly rampant. There was no real middle class. It was rich and poor. You didn't have labor laws and protections and practices. You didn't have federal holidays. You didn't have health insurance and supports paid for by your taxes. And so there was just a lot of suffering. And looking at some of the things that are happening around the world as we see this rise of geopolitical violence. We see an increase in, first time in decades, land war in Europe. You're seeing, continued genocides. This is an era where, yes, those things existed in the past, but our ability to share information or misinformation is faster than ever before. Our weapons are more dangerous and in many cases unmanned. And so we have this environment of instability that is taking hold. and it's becoming the new normal. And so we're seeing organizations, even just in the news, talking about the market instability this week of like, hey, we can't make budgets, we can't make plans because we can't keep track of what the financial monetary policy is going to be. It's all over the place. And so even things like the stock market that are considered fairly stable by many standards are seeing instability, and that's causing businesses to feel like our old way of doing things just doesn't apply anymore. And that awareness that we are sort of in this age of chaos, I think, is one that people need to embrace so that they can not drive themselves crazy.
Mm-hmm. So what is that looking like in maybe some examples if someone's listening to this and they're like, am I in a chaotic organization right now, or a chaotic team, or a chaotic office? What are some of the signs?
Burnout is a good one. Human beings, as we try to respond to a chaotic environment, I said earlier, our brains are both really beautifully complex and also simple at the same time. We're not really designed to be living in a world of AI and smartphones and social media. And so there's a cognitive overload that happens where people start to just shut off their brain to self-protect. And that's kind of like, being like a robot and powering down. Willpower is a finite resource, and so you're using all this willpower to kind of deal with stressors that are popping up. You're being notified every 5 minutes on social media that something has happened or in the news, and so we're not used to that. And you might notice that you are really tired, that you are getting sick more often. Maybe you're having more headaches and muscle pain. Maybe you are having trouble sleeping. Maybe you're experiencing digestion issues, intestinal, stomach upset. IBS is a very common side effect of high levels of consistent stress. And in fact, we know from research, from the ACE studies, longitudinal studies of impacts of trauma, that long-term low-level trauma can lead to things like ischemic heart disease, can lead to stomach ulcers. And so there are, migraines. There are these long-term effects that people can end up with from exposure to long-term stress and chaos. So you're going to experience it in your body first, and then the psyche can follow. And there's a mix of both, because how you think is how you feel, and how you feel is how you act. So there's this whole body effect that occurs for people. But in the workspace specifically, alongside some of those physical effects, you might see people feeling like, my work doesn't matter. My company, no one cares about this stuff. It's unimportant. Your accomplishments lose meaning. You start to get really disillusioned and antagonistic with your peers. Maybe you start just dropping out of meetings and disengaging. And so there's a number of behaviors that we kind of look for to see where people are struggling. And we're seeing that happen frequently. And I see that with my peers and colleagues. I see it with myself sometimes, and I have to self-correct. But there is this burnout epidemic, and there's been some really great studies in the tech space, and what they found was almost 70% of tech workers 2021, 2022, 2023 reported high levels of burnout.
So yeah, when you're saying that, I'm thinking well, that sounds like your average workplace. I thought I was asking a question about this new phenomenon that's suddenly emergent, but the 70% disengagement or burnout or stress.
Yeah,
that's par for the course. I'm interested in where that doesn't happen. How do you avoid that these days?
To a degree, I don't know if we do avoid it entirely. Positive psychology, I remember looking at Seligman's work back in 2008, 9, 10, and this idea that you could inoculate people from trauma. And I'm overly simplifying it, so don't, Martin Seligman, and crew, don't come for me. But they were doing some work with the military around how do you inoculate against trauma so that people don't become traumatized by their military service. And, most trauma specialists and behavioralists would say that is impossible. You do not inoculate people. What you do is you provide supports on the back end to help that trauma be less prolonged, to help those effects of burnout stick around not as long as they normally would, and help them build resiliency to rebound quicker. There are some workplaces that have a really great reputation. I will say, to the credit of my organization, I work for a company called Elsevier. I get tremendous amount of PTO, and the pace of our work is one that I don't see often. But we are owned by a Dutch parent company. We have a lot of sort of European practices, and I think that style of working lends itself to a little bit of a healthier culture than, say, some of what we see in American workplaces. And so yeah, it does exist in pockets, but we can't always prevent that. And so we should really focus on the resilience building and mitigation after the fact.
That's interesting because, you grow up in learning about positive psychology, like Seligman's work is like, untouchable as, sort of the father of it. And I read a book that had quite an impact on me a few years ago. I think it's called The Quick Fix by Jesse Singal, talking about like the actual studies. And that, it was like a shock to me that apparently a lot of positive psychology really was not backed up by research. It was just like really good marketing,
Yeah.
with people who was hearing what they wanted to hear, as opposed to what was actually going to help people.
I mean, you nailed it. I mean, that's something that I see so often in the organizational development space. And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of science backing work in that space, and IO Psych, but there's a tremendous amount of nonsense that exists in there that was used to just sell people on keeping the status quo. And in fact, there is a market, and I think about some of the big consulting firms, not naming any names so I don't get sued, but there are folk who get paid a lot of money to come in and have the appearance of making change, have the appearance of doing anything, but they're really just being paid to keep things the same and then lay people off. That's not quite positive psych, but I'm thinking about Paul Gibbons and his work on change management. He talks about how, he kind of got lambasted and attacked by the positive psych crew. And then years later, they came back and realized that, no, he was right on, especially around how change happens in organizations. And it's really habit-based. And that, you need to be focused a little bit less on this whole like culture change and more like habit change. And that is how we make larger change in organizations, appealing to the heart and the emotions, the behavior and the habits of people. And you're doing it, person by person, team by team. You don't just show up and say, okay, now we're going to change the culture. That lands like 20% of the time or less. And so we are starting to kind of dismantle some of our heroes and ideologies that have been around for a while, recognizing that in the corporate world, some of this stuff was nonsense by design. And we really need to bring a science-based approach.
Tell me more about Paul Gibbons, because I'm not familiar with his work. He sounds like a very important thinker and practitioner that I should know better.
He's a really cool guy, and I'll be honest, I'm really just starting to learn more of his work. I've followed some of his change management stuff. I read one of his books a number of years ago, and I was really struck by his condemnation of the idea of culture change, that you can just shift the culture. And the way, and it resonated with me because I'd studied the Prochaska and DiClemente's trans-theoretical model of change, and understanding that people and organizations, and I think it was Prochaska's wife who studied how that model can apply to organizations, how, change is a process. It's not an event. And those of us who are coaches and work with people, we know this. But, you might be surprised, dear listeners, how many people walk into an organization or leaders in an organization think, we're going to tell people we're changing and we've changed. And that's it. And Paul Gibbons really starts to pull apart that myth that if you want to create change, you have to change people's habits. That is the most important thing that you can start doing. And you need to create incentives in the system itself that encourage that habit change. So, you don't just tell people, go get vaccinated. You create an environment where there are significant benefits for people who go in and get their vaccination. That was one example that he used. And they're like around eating healthy. You don't just tell people to eat their vegetables. You have to make healthy foods more affordable and more accessible. You have to set it up in a way that's much easier for them to get than the junky stuff. And so those types of incentivized structures and systems are what's needed in organizations as well to create behavioral change. Just saying you're changing is absurd, and in fact people do actively push very hard against that versus incrementally, slowly creating incentives for them to change their behavior.
Right. I mean, I'm hearing sort of elements of both, where the culture is really about telling a new story.
Yes, that's another piece of this. But it is one that speaks to the heart. It's not this we are changing because it's going to help our bottom line. It's appealing to the pain points that people have and why you nailed it, the narrative of why this is going to make your life better and why you're going to, this will create a happier, healthier environment for you. Things that they actually care about.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is, before I ever even got to considering the positive incentives for change, we had to discover all the disincentives for change that were already locked in, from
Yes,
compensation to, just how the competition between biz dev and operations, or the competition between legal and sales, or there were like every organization. I learned this when I started selling into organizations, that every organization thinks of winners and losers, because almost every organization, people are optimizing for something less than the total joyful success of the whole mission.
Yes.
And until, as long as that's happening, there's always going to be these irrationalities where everyone wants to do X, but everyone's really incentive to do Y and Z instead.
Yeah, you nail it. It's funny, for as much as we talk about collaboration in the business world, competition is the de facto choice for a lot of groups. And I'm sure it's inherent in some of the business ideology and ideas of the market, and and just sort of competing against your outside external market competitors. But that comes internal, and it can create these very us versus them tribalistic environments that you've clearly run into. We would find back in the consultant days that the resistance that we got from people was very manageable, but the political resistance that we were getting from warring factions inside of organizations was way harder to counter and way harder to deal with, and often entrenched for decades in some cases. Whereas with a person, you can work with that. You can work with a smaller group of people, but warring departments, that's a little bit harder.
Yeah, I remember when one group I worked with in sort of the healthcare space, we had these two groups that didn't realize they were being systematically set up to be in opposition. And you do that long enough, and they're in different wings of the building or different floors, and this vision of the enemy just metastasizes. And because there is an inherent tension, everything then gets filtered through the confirmation bias of like, what a bunch of assholes, what a bunch of cowboys, how they lie to people, they are too timid, and so bringing like the work we did ended up like bringing them together and doing kind of role plays where they kind of played each other's roles.
Very powerful.
It doesn't take much to elicit empathy.
No, you're correct. We would have these situations where you have frontline employees that are union, and then you have managers who may have been union at one time and no longer are, and they were like they'd been fighting a civil war for 30 years, and all it often took was bringing them into a room together and having them talk about scenarios that they experienced, and having the manager say, "Hey, I'm really sorry. That sounds incredibly scary to hear it from your position. When I showed up on the scene, I was just trying to follow the protocol, and so I really didn't get what you were going through." And then you have the manager sort of tell what they're going through, and a lot of times you'll hear these hardened employees say, "Wow, I didn't realize your job was so hard. I didn't realize you were dealing with all this stuff and you don't have the resources you need to do it." And that understanding that you're talking about that's showing up here, it can be very transformative. And it sounds simple, and in a lot of ways, empathy can be simple, but we don't have structures that encourage us to do that type of exchange, especially in workplaces, and in our personal lives even as well. So yes, empathy can be such a powerful tool for organizational change and changing narratives, and getting people to change their ideas about these groups that they've come to really dislike. Yeah,
well, the image that came to me, and I think this comes from some Zen koan or wisdom story from Buddhism about the image is like someone with their head held underwater. Like they don't have mental space for a lot beyond the next breath of air.
That's right.
And I think there's a lot about our society and a lot about our organizations that put people close to that state of survival being so paramount that higher emotions, empathy, or even the ones we say we lionize and want in organizations, creativity, strategy, long-term planning, vision, that when you are concerned about your next gulp of air, it's almost impossible to to touch into these other things.
It was something that we did a lot, was teaching executives about trauma. And, not necessarily like, hey, your employees are being traumatized for life, but just this is what survival mode looks like when people are working under high stress. And right to your point, if all they can focus on is surviving, they're not going to be focused on giving great customer service. They're not going to be focused on having these great interpersonal interactions because they're worried about getting stabbed, shot, beat up, verbally abused. And so really trying to change that perspective for people. And then for us, before I got into the business work, I wasn't really thinking about executives being under board and shareholder pressure. And some of those execs, they also feel like they're fighting for their life. It's a very different circumstance. And they're not likely to get, attacked in the same way their frontline employee might. But there is a sense of survival mode that is permeating organizations that you're referencing here, and providing some education on that, even if it's sort of surface level, can be really helpful to try to normalize and help people understand what's happening in their organizations. And we did it for years, and it was, I think, one of the things that really stuck. When I came back and met with leaders years after the fact, or I'd see people in Philly on the street, or in places where I was visiting for work, and they would say, yeah, man, that trauma stuff, like I started seeing it in my life, and I really get how it's happening in our company. And so just, I think education can be really paramount, but it has to be done in a way that is impactful. And again, leveraging, science and behavioral science. Because as you know, a lot of corporate training, like I said earlier, very fluffy, not a lot of use in some of that stuff, but it's a service, and they're getting paid to deliver it, and it's a very lucrative field.
Yeah, and just to respond to the difference between, say, a frontline employee who's facing physical danger and an executive, as you pointed out earlier, our brains can't tell the difference. Right? Like if someone criticizes me, I'm working on this. I've been working on it for half a century. But like when I get criticized, my body goes into physical reactions that only make sense if I am trying to get away from a predator.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing my body is doing that's helping me deal with this situation.
Yes. I mean, and we have this wonderful set of coping skills that are powered by the neurochemicals that flood into our system when we feel under threat. The noradrenaline, the cortisol, the dopamine and serotonin that flood us, that are used to kind of keep us alive and have us not feel pain when we're running out of a burning building, or we've got some heavy thing trapped on top of us. That stuff floods into us when we're having a fight with a spouse, when we're being criticized and getting a performance review at work. And so really helpful when you got to lift a giant heavy rock off of you, or really helpful when you're carrying someone out of a burning building. Not helpful when you are trying to have a conversation with your partner. Not helpful when you are trying to receive a performance evaluation. But your brain doesn't care.
So I'm curious, who are your favorite trauma people? Like the folks who teach and write and advocate and educate.
Yeah. I got started with Peter Levine with his book Waking the Tiger. I'm a big fan of that. I've always been into somatic healing. As a young person, I got into martial arts. And it's been a powerful vehicle for me for stress relief and sort of dealing with trauma that pops up in our lives. And then from there, I kind of moved on to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and I got to actually speak at his trauma conference on this martial arts program that we were running for veterans and youth who were in homeless shelters, and veterans who were also in homeless shelters and had experienced major injuries in the war. And I was really fascinated by both of their approaches and how plugged into the body they both were. Because while I do think that tremendous healing happens with cognitive work, there is stuff that gets trapped in our body that we need to work through. And it's hard to do that while sitting in the chair. So, those are two that really stand out to me.
Yeah, boy, those are two. It's hard to shoehorn into a boardroom or an auditorium, isn't it?
Yeah, but we started doing like physical movement exercises with workers, and then we would kind of explain like at a very high level why it was beneficial, and it was some of the favorite stuff we did. And I remembered like doing an activity that we called river crossing that got all these execs up and moving, and I think it was the one thing they remembered from the work that we did. And so absolutely, it's hard to bring in, and it's hard to sort of concisely pitch that stuff, but when people get to act it out and do some of that movement work, it can really stay with them.
I mean, I also think in terms of like what it can unleash. Like you talked about someone who got triggered by a simulation
Yes.
of a like, when things get like, you and I can have a conversation, but as soon as I'm uncomfortable, you can see me closing up intellectually, doing all sorts of, but when my body's moving and something breaks free, I'm fucked. I don't have that kind of control.
You have these live and you learn moments. We had to really change our approaches over the years. I remember somebody started disrobing in the middle of a movement activity, and that was the only time it got that incredibly intense, where we had to get them out of the room and the space and sort of do some intensive work with them. But that was like a big wake up of like, we've really sanitized this stuff, but it's so powerful that even though we've really tried to put guardrails around it, you can't control how people are going to respond to everything. So yes, you have to be incredibly careful, and we really changed and adjusted some of our approaches over the years because of the things that we learned and saw, just how impactful and elicitive this stuff can be for people when they haven't had exposure to it.
Yeah, and I think that when you take away all risk, you also lose a lot of the upside.
Yes, we've seen beautiful catharsis and transformation in these programs, and after I left Red Kite and stopped doing some of that paladin have gun will travel consultant work, and moving into a specific organization that I've been at for 5 years, I'm still able to use these things with people. I mean, I think it's the thing that has set me apart in my career is the behavioral science angle. And so I urge anyone who is wondering, like, can I use this in the corporate space? I think probably a lot of your guests have proven that yes, you can. And I'm saying it again, not only can you use it, but it is critical in a lot of cases in today's business world where we are seeing high levels of burnout, high levels of trauma, high levels of chaos. These are the things that actually work in the face of those things. They were designed to handle these moments. That's what this behavioral science counseling work was created for.
So I'm curious, what was your martial art?
I did a bunch over the years. I started with Taekwondo as a kid, and then I got into Wei Chi Ru karate. I did Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and boxing has kind of been where I've settled up. Are you a martial artist also?
I did a Russian form called Sistema for a decade.
Cool. Yeah, I know about Sistema.
Okay. I'm doing boxing now just because the trainer that I work with likes to punch me.
Yeah.
So I'm finding it a very different thing to think of a sport as opposed to Sistema is basically no rules, and so I mean what I'm curious about is like and also thinking about my audience when you say you learn sort of healing from a martial art. I don't think people who haven't done it understand the connection between, like, martial art is like you hurt people. Like what are you talking about?
Yeah, it's when I was a kid, like I said, I was a bit of a knucklehead, and the facilitation was really helpful, but the martial arts was also tremendously impactful to my mental health. Finding a vehicle for me to be able to release energy that felt trapped in my body, to have a level of discipline over my body when I felt like it wasn't mine to control. That sort of mental part of practicing martial arts can be healing and transformative. And just kinetic movement and being able to kind of shake up those neurochemicals that get kind of trapped within us, being able to shake that stuff up, shake it off, and like allow our brain to kind of cycle through it and be sort of refreshed with these chemicals that are better serving us. That can't be understated how powerful that can be. And one of the things that we saw happen working with researchers with our Red Kite Rising program, working with kids in shelters, they were having violent events almost every day. And we got to a point where after a number of sessions, they stopped having violent events for weeks. And kids were able to find a level of self-control that they didn't feel that they had. And with veterans, we saw folks putting down their canes and being able to step back into their body again, feeling like they had control over it. And so, over time, they started to feel like, well, I don't, my body isn't capable of doing this. But as they got into somatic healing work, the cane became a little less important for them. And that's an extreme example, but it was an incredible one that we saw several veterans not using aids that they were using before. And so I think there's a lot of ways that martial arts can help people. It doesn't just have to be a tool for hurting. But the one caveat I'll call out is that there is research that for kids who have a violent history, teaching them striking sports is not as valuable as teaching them grappling or things that are not, not directly violent. So, think Tai Chi, think maybe things like wrestling or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can be better for them. But for adults, it's fine to whatever gets you moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that I've experienced is, at least in the schools where I've studied, I only worked with partners, right? It was never an opponent, right? You go spar with your partner, and what you're doing is teaching each other and helping each other. And of course, if you're in the middle of a grappling or striking, you can get adrenalized and you can flip your frame. And all of a sudden, this person is my enemy. And to notice when that happens and to be called out when that happens, like, to me, that was as close as I've come to what you described in Drexel around, a life, a safe situation where unsafe things can be experienced.
That's a great example. I mean, it's a perfect example. That self-awareness that you gain about yourself, I think, is hard unless you find a way to simulate that. And martial arts can give you those experiences.
So we're coming to the end of the time that I promised I would take of yours. I know you are you're at is it Elsevier? How do you say that?
Elsevier.
Elsevier. I've been reading, and I've written books in the health field, so I have known the name. I've never heard it said. Elsevier. That's. Is there a way for that people can follow you, or I usually offer my guests to thank them for taking an hour, like, get business from this. I don't know if that's of interest to you, or for Red Kite, or work on the side, or just more to share that people could follow you. But how would you like to? Is there an invitation you'd like to offer to the listeners and viewers?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Jacobson, for having me on your podcast. This is an awesome experience. I really appreciated the opportunity to get to share a little bit of my mindset and my experience. That was a pleasure. People can connect with me on LinkedIn. There's a couple different ways you can reach me, but LinkedIn is a very easy one. And Red Kite, I'm not with them, but I'm still a silent partner, and I connect with them on the work that they're doing. If you're fascinated by this approach of sort of leveraging civil society building and trauma-informed behavioral science for organizational change and development, hit up Red Kite Project. Charlotte DiBartolomeo is an incredible thought leader on organizational change, and
Can you say her name again?
Yeah,
Charlotte
DiBartolomeo. Is a mouthful, as she will say.
Okay, well, I'll put that in the show notes. I'll get the links for you for Red Kite. I'll put in the links to the books, to Waking the Tiger and Body Keeps the Score, and I invite people to connect with you on LinkedIn, because you got a lot of really interesting things to say.
Thank you very much again for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the work you've done in the world that you're bringing to some of the hardest places that need it the most. So
thanks.
It was great connecting with you, and I'm so happy to have learned some things and to have made a new friend.
Absolutely.
And that's a wrap. You can get the show notes with links to everything we talked about today at plantyourself.com/623. In movement news, I have returned to yoga, and I'm studying with a couple of friends of mine, John and Jesse of monkeybargym.com. I first met them 20 years ago. I studied with them in their training facility in Madison, Wisconsin in 2005, have kept up with them. During the pandemic, they went fully virtual, digital, and they've just come out with an app that I'm really enjoying, helping me to get back mobility, flexibility, build strength on a base of stability so that I can move easier and stop injuring myself. If you're interested, I know it's on the Apple Store or the iPhone Store, and I think it's either coming or it's already on the Android Store. Just search for Monkey Bar Gym, and you'll see the app, and I think they have like a 2-week free trial, so you can give it a try and see if it helps you as much as I hope it's going to help me. Other movement news, switched beaches, now going back to San Sebastian Beach instead of Fragata. it's easier for my trainer. We're now working, the reason that's important, we're now working with actual weights. So instead of just bands, he's actually bringing dumbbells and kettlebells, and this is closer to his house. So he just doesn't have to carry, 100 pounds of iron up through past the church and down the stairs. So we're back to this beach where we first started, where we trained when I lived downtown. So that's probably way more information than you care about. But also, this is a little bit weird. I played Ultimate Frisbee since 1977, making this 48 years, and I've just learned how to throw the sidearm, the finger flick, differently, so they get more control over it. So it turns out that I was holding it very loosely, and now I'm gripping it much more tightly. So now the beginning of all of our workouts with my trainer is we spend about 5 to 10 minutes just running around on the beach throwing the disc. So it was just for warm up and cardio, but now I'm actually improving my throws. So hopefully I'll be a little bit more of a deep throwing threat or an accurate break mark threat in games going forward. That's it for this week. As always, be well, my friends.